This video is about Greek participles. Greek participles are probably the hardest single aspect of the Greek language, at least for those who are learning it by memory, who are memorizing the forms. It's still quite involved even if you're using tools that give you the forms, that parse things for you, because Greek is a participial loving language. What this basically turns out to be is that what in English are often relative clauses, the man who I was talking about, that phrase, who I was talking about, is a relative clause. Greek will often do something like that with a participle, with one word. If you're following an interlinear, participles are probably the most likely place for you to find 5 or 6 or 7 English words that correspond to just one word in Greek. Greek is a participial loving language, and if you can master Greek participles, then you've broken the back of the language in terms of understanding. I would say there are many other complicated things, but this is the thing that seems to really be the greatest challenge to Greek students, especially in the traditional format. Well, what is a participle? A participle is, just to start off with, an ing word. So walking, running, talking, these are more interesting adjectives, more interesting describing words. There are the boring adjectives like sad, happy, hot, cold. But what about the jumping bean or the running man? Those are verbal adjectives. A participle is a verbal adjective. It's part verb, part adjective. And so actually more adjective than verb probably in some respects. Well, depends on the situation. But we can start by thinking of it as an ing word. But really that's the the present participle. There are also past participles that are often ed words. So walking would be a present participle, but destroyed might be a past participle. Or burnt. English isn't regular in how it makes these. Seen, for example, is certainly not regular. Basically, whatever form fits with I am blanking, I am walking, running, talking, that's the present participle. And whatever form in English fits with I have blanked, I have walked, I have talked, I have burnt, I have seen, whatever fits in that blank, that's the past participle. So there's a little bit about what participles are. Okay, how does Greek use participles? I want to divide the use of Greek participles into 3 basic categories. This is going to get you 97% of the way. I just made that number up. But probably the easiest use of a participle is one that is often very much just like English, and that's what we would call the periphrastic use of a participle. He was eating. Eating is a participle. Was is a to-be verb, a linking verb. And so sometimes you'll have that. Ein means he was, she was, or it was, and then estheon is the participle. So he was eating. And you've got the was there, you've got the eating there. So it's just pretty much translating the Greek words straightforwardly, and it works in English. It won't always, but it can. So the periphrastic use of the participle is, in some cases, the simplest use of the participle. Participles can also be used adverbially. An adverb is a word that tells you something about the verb, for example, how the verb was done, or why the verb was done, or when the verb was done. And so one of the most famous adverbial participles is in Matthew 28:19, the Great Commission. The main verb in the Great Commission is the verb make disciples. But there is a participle on it, going, or having gone, make disciples. And probably translations are right to make it into somewhat of a light command, go and make disciples, because as you'll find out in this vidcast, one of the functions of an adverbial participle can be the imperatival function. But here it's telling you the circumstances under which you're making disciples at the very least, or it may be even a light command, go and make disciples. So in Greek, poruthentes is a participle, having gone, mathetusete, make disciples. Okay, Lastly, a participle can be adjectival, in which case it's telling you about a noun. So the one who comes, ha erkamenos, the one who comes. All of that can come out of that. Those two words there where ha is the word the. It's literally something like, or woodenly, something like the coming one, or the coming man, or something like that. The coming something masculine. If you remember adjectives from another video, adjectives can be used substantively. That means that they can be used without a noun actually there. The noun is implied, as in the phrase the good, the bad, the ugly. The good people, the bad people, the ugly people. People is implied. And so participles that are adjectival can be used substantively as well, where the noun isn't actually there. So those are the three basic functions of Greek participles. I'm now going to unpack them in greater detail. But first, for those of you who are using an interlinear, in particular Mounts and Mounce's Greek-English interlinear, you might be encountering this video on participles late in the journey of learning that code in Mounts and Mounce. As far as Mounts and Mounce is concerned, N means noun. I imagine this will be similar for most analytical concordances that parse the words for you. So an N indicates that you're looking at a word that's a noun. V, a word that's a verb. A, this is Mounts and Mounce, a word that's an adjective. ADV, a word that's an adverb. D means you're looking at the word the definite article. P, a preposition. CJ, a conjunction. And R, pronoun. So if you're using, say, Mounts and Mounce, and I imagine it'll be similar in other analyticals, PT stands for participle. Okay, so here is an example of the kind of code that a analytical, such as Mounts and Mounce's Greek-English one, published by Zondervan, will give you. So PT, legon is the word. The PT tells you that this is a participle. PA tells you that it's a present active participle. And then NSM tells you that it's a nominative singular masculine participle. And so the PA here has to do with the verbal part of the participle. So as a verb type word, it is present tense and active voice. And then the NSM has to do with the adjective part of the word. It is nominative singular masculine as an adjective. So that's somewhat how the code works. That's what I've just said. It's participle, present active, nominative singular masculine. Okay, so what are some starter translations, some rated G translations for participles? Well, for a present active participle, I would suggest that you start by just tacking an ing onto the word. So if your analytical concordance tells you that it's a present active participle, an ing word is a good way to start as a rough draft translation. If it's present passive, then you might do being ed. So being loved or being burnt. You would use that form of it. If it's PP, if the analytical concordance tells you that it's a present passive participle. If it's aorist or perfect active participle, I suggest you start off with having blanked, having loved, for example, having burnt, having seen. Now, you might ask, well, what's the difference between the aorist participle and the perfect participle? How can you have the same translation, or at least starter translation? Well, the difference is in the connotation. If it's an aorist active participle and you translate it as having loved, he asked her to go on a trip. Having loved her, he asked her to go, on a cruise. If it's aorist, it's just saying, bleh, he did it. He had loved her at some point. Having loved her. There's no real extra connotation. If it's a perfect active participle, however, then the author has intentionally put extra meaning into it. The perfect tense has the sense of something that's completed, but that the results of which have continued. And so having loved her, meaning that at some point in the past he came to love her, and he still loves her. He asked her to go on vacation. So that construction has extra meaning when it's a perfect active participle than it doesn't have when it's an aorist active participle. But having loved in English will suffice for both. This is one of those instances where English doesn't really have a construction that can clarify entirely the Greek construction. Greek has a construction with a meaning that is harder to reproduce in English, and this is of course the problem with translation and the benefit of learning the original languages. Aorist perfect or perfect passive then might be translated with this construction, having been loved, burnt, seen, and so forth. So these are 4 starter translations. Sometimes that will work to get the sense of the participle that you're looking at. However, this is the rated G version. It does tend to get a little bit more complicated depending on whether you're looking at a periphrastic use or a adverbial use or an adjectival use. And when you begin to get more precise in your English translation, when you improve your English translation, the words tend to multiply. But let's start with the periphrastic. I said it was the easiest in many cases. Most periphrastic constructions are pretty easy. So I mentioned this one, which is taken from Mark 1. John the Baptist was eating. Ein estheon. So using Mounce and Mounce's code, this is a verb. It is imperfect. It's not really active, but that's the code they use. Indicative. You don't need to know that for participles. Third person singular, which means the subject is a he, she, or it. Turns out that it's a he, John the Baptist. This is not what this video is about, but was is a good translation of it. Here we have this participle. Present active participle, nominative singular masculine. All periphrastic participles are going to be nominative because the to be verb is like a equal sign when it comes to grammar. And since the subject is going to be nominative, therefore this participle is going to be nominative. Not important to know, really. He was eating. Again, the words just translate straight into English, no problem. So here are some examples of periphrastic constructions. A to be verb plus a participle. I am going. She was losing. He will be baptizing. We were being loosed. Again, the Greek words in these cases would just translate directly. No problems. Now there are some trickier periphrastics, and this is basically when you have a perfect participle. So this is a perfect passive participle. When you have a perfect participle, it's a little more complicated. It doesn't make good English. So for example, he was having been clothed is bad English. It's a bad translation. And here there's a common misconception that a literal, and actually that's not the right word, a wooden, let me say a wooden or stilted translation is not a good translation. To bring these words immediately into English in this way, he was having been clothed, is not to give a better translation. That's a bad English translation, even though it is very wooden in terms of word-for-word correspondence. People think that a formal equivalence translation is thereby automatically a better translation. That may not at all be the case. This is a certain kind of subcultural thinking that we have in certain Christian circles, that wooden equals better. No, a good translation is one that most accurately represents the meaning of the original language into the new language. That's a good translation. A good translation is not one that tries to reproduce the sentence structure of the original language, because English is not Greek. To put Greek words to bring Greek into English with the same sentence structure it has in Greek is to create a bad translation. Well, what are we going to do here? A way to do this, if you have a past and a perfect, then probably you're going to use the word had. He had been clothed with camel hair and a leather belt, that sort of thing, again from Mark 1. So you're going to use have or had when it comes to these kinds of perfect participle periphrastics. So he is having loved, you're going to translate as he has loved. we were having loved, you will translate we had loved. And of course, if you're looking at an interlinear, then Mounts or whoever hopefully has already done this work for you. She was having been loved. Again, horrible English, but you can translate it as she had been loved. So if you have a present form of the verb to be with a perfect participle, use has. If you have a past tense form of the verb to be with a perfect participle, use had. Okay, and this is basically to summarize what I've just said. The present participles with the present form of the verb to be are nice and straightforward. You basically just put the words together. He is loosing, he was loosing, he is being loosed, he was being loosed. The present participle is a dream. However, with the perfect participle, it's a little more complicated. If you have a present form of the verb to be with the perfect participle, use has. If you have was with the perfect participle, use had. And then this is the passive here. Has or had been loosed. So this is the first use of the participle, not the most important one, but probably the easiest one. We then move on then to adverbial participles, participles that tell you about the verb in some way. Adverbial participles will not have an article on them. They will not have the word the on them. Unfortunately, just because a participle doesn't have the article doesn't necessarily mean that it's adverbial. There are adjectival participles, the last part of this video, that don't have the word the on it. If a participle has the word the on it, it's definitely adjectival, which is the last slide in this series. If it does not have the article, the word the on it, then it is probably adverbial. Not necessarily. You have to let the context determine. It's basically a question of whether it is telling you more about the verb or whether it's telling you more about some noun, and usually context makes that clear. There are several possible nuances that the adverbial participle can have. Beginning Greek students usually only learn one, the temporal one, and so they usually translate, they might add the word while or the word after to a participle that's being used this way. That works in many cases. Brooks and Winberry, Syntax of New Testament Greek, that I've sometimes used, lists 10 possible nuances of the adverbial participle. However, I've tried to boil them down to 7 so that that I'm clarifying the ones that you're most likely to need to know about. So I'm going to group 3 of them into circumstantial participle, maybe 4 of them. So I'm going to lump the temporal participle, what Brooks and Winberry call the circumstantial participle, something called the modal, well, I'm not sure that I'm lumping. Anyway, I'm giving you the ones that you most need to know to be able to make sense of translations. A circumstantial participle, basically, the participle is telling you the circumstances of the main verb. So there is a little complication here that I'll go ahead and slip in here. The timing of a participle is not absolute. It's not Newtonian timing. It's Einsteinian timing. It's relative timing. So a present participle doesn't mean that the participle is happening right now. A present participle means that the participle is happening at the same time as the main verb. Let me give you an example. Walking, Jesus went into Capernaum. Now that's a present participle, walking. But Jesus went into Capernaum 2,000 years ago. So even though it's a present participle, it's not telling walking today, Jesus went into Capernaum 2,000 years ago. That doesn't make any sense. What I'm telling you right now basically is common sense, even though it's hard to sometimes articulate. Walking is present with relation to Jesus going into Capernaum. He was walking when he went into Capernaum, in other words. It's present in relation to the main verb, not present with regard to now or absolute time. It's present relative to going into Capernaum. Same thing with an aorist participle when it has a temporal meaning. And the aorist participle doesn't always mean that you're talking about timing. Timing tends to go out the window once you leave statement type verbs, indicative verbs, timing tends to of the aorist tends to become out the window, not important. Some scholars would say it's not even there in the present, or some scholars would say timing isn't even there in the indicative, that we're fooling ourselves. Stanley Porter, for example. If we go with the classic, aorist tends to mean past time in the indicative. It does not necessarily mean past time when we get into participles. If the aorist does mean past time, then it's something that happened before the main verb. It is past in relation to the main verb of the sentence, not past in relation to today. So if you say, having heard Jesus was in Bethany, he went there. So having heard is past in relation to going to Bethany to see Jesus. He hears, then he goes to see Jesus. It would be past in relation to the main verb, not past in terms of absolute time. The aorist can simply mean something that happened simply, undefined is the basic meaning of the aorist. So there are places in the Gospels and so forth where the aorist is simply telling you the circumstances of something, having seen the multitudes. Well, no, I don't know. It can happen. It can be same time as well, and not have any time connotation as well. In that case, then the distinction between a present participle and an aorist participle doesn't have to do with timing, but it has to do with the kind of action. The present tense meaning continuous action, and the aorist tense simply meaning undefined, or I'm not going to tell you how it happened kind of action. Some of that may be the kind of thing that goes right over your head, or that you need to listen to several times. It's one of those things that you shouldn't sweat, because you can get most things about participles that are important without necessarily getting these finer points. Let me go back to the bigger picture, and that is that some participles are circumstantial, which means that they tell you the something about the main verb. Jesus preached saying. Here, saying is just kind of telling you how he preached. This would be probably a modal participle if I were to be technical, but I'm trying to simplify things. So he's saying as he preaches. He's preaching by saying. It's the mode of him preaching. But that's a simple enough one. You didn't need to know anything. All you needed to know was the rated G translation of ing to be able to handle that one. After departing, I went away. It's a bit of a strange example that I came up with, but here might be a temporal use of the participle, giving you the what happened right before I went away. When fasting, anoint your head. Although that after departing could be an example of the aorist participle simply telling you more circumstances. You might not even want the word after. Departing, I went away. Anyway, when fasting, anoint your head. Again, the circumstances of anointing your head are when fasting. Or while saying these things, many believed. Basically, what I'm getting at here is that these words aren't in Greek. You're not going to find the word after before the participle, or when before the participle, or while before the participle. These are simply nuances that the ing word has. And this brings me to a very important point. The nuances of adverbial participles, as I think you'll see in the next few slides, are very enlightening. They're very helpful. But it's not a question of secret meaning or hidden meaning. It's not going through the list of the 10 possible adverbial nuances and saying, ooh, wouldn't it be meaty and neat if what Paul was using here was an instrumental participle? Wow, wouldn't that be profound? That's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about finding hidden truth. We're talking about a kind of feel that the participle is giving off anyway, to where when you say, you know what, if I put the word when in front of fasting, it really captures the sense here. Fasting, anoint your head, is what the Greek says. But if I put the word when in front of it, when fasting, anoint your head, it's better English, and it really brings out the meaning. So as you'll see in the next few slides, this is not about inventing stuff that's not there or finding secret truths that can impress your friends and congregations. It's about trusting the force. It's about feeling the force of the participle that's already there, to where when you say, what if we put this word in front of it, like when, or some of the words that I'm going to show you in the next slides, you say, yeah, that really gets at what it's saying. So here's an example. Causal participles. These are participles where we can feel the word because or the word since there. So take this. Wanting to release Jesus, Pilate talked to them about letting someone go at the Feast of Passover. Wanting to release Jesus. Can't you feel that there's a because there? Because he wanted to release Jesus. Pilate. We're not inventing things. It was already implicit there. We could feel the force of wanting to release Jesus is giving the motivation why Pilate then tries to let Barabbas go, because he wanted to release Jesus. There's another example, I think, in Romans 5:1. Having been justified by faith, therefore, we have peace with God. Can't you feel the because we have been justified by faith, we have peace with God? And it's perfectly legitimate to stick that because into the English translation, because that is exactly the nuance of the adverbial participle. Conditional participle. Not giving up, we will reap in due time. Can't you feel an if there? If we do not give up, we will reap. Now here's the thing, not giving up may be one participle, one word in Greek, and yet here is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, no, there'll have to be a not there. There'll have to be a different word for not, but if we do not give up. So you see, it's perfectly legitimate to have 5 or 6 words in the English translation to correspond to one word in Greek, and in fact, if you don't do that sort of thing, it's an inferior English translation. So if can sometimes be a nuance, telling the conditions during of which the main verb takes place. Another example of this is in Hebrews 2:2. If the word spoken, or Hebrews 2:3, if the word spoken by angels was firm, and every disobedience and transgression brought on a just punishment, then how will we escape having neglected such a great salvation? Can't you feel the if? How will we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? We're not making things up. We're not finding hidden meanings. We are clarifying the nuance of the adverbial participle. They can also be concessive. Being blind, now I see. Now obviously these don't take place at the same time. But what if we introduce the word although? Although I was blind, now I see. Another example of this is in Hebrews 1:1, I believe. God, having spoken formerly to the fathers through the prophets in many and various ways, in these last days has spoken to us through a Son. Can't you feel the although? Although God spoke formerly to the fathers through the prophets in many and various ways, in these last days he has spoken to us through a Son. Again, not making it up, simply clarifying the meaning there. I think there's an although in the Philippian hymn in Philippians 2. Jesus, existing in the form of God. Here's the Greek. Existing in the form of God, he did not consider equality with God something to exploit. Can't you feel the although? Although he existed in the form of God, he did not consider equality with God something to exploit. These are very helpful in interpretation. These are intermediate Greek categories. The instrumental participle. Worrying, who can add a cubit? By worrying, who can add a cubit? The instrumental participle tells you the means by which the main verb takes place. So, by means of worrying, who can add a cubit? Purpose participle, where you can feel something like in order that. Going to worship, he came to Jerusalem. Can't you sense the sense of purpose? In order to worship, he came to worship. He came to Jerusalem. Then lastly, let me mention this command participle. Hating the evil, hold fast to the good. And I think the hold is mistranslated there. So it can be translated as a light command. Hate the evil, hold fast to the good. And this is probably what the participle in the Great Commission is. Go and make disciples is a fine translation. Grammatically, make disciples is the emphasis. Make disciples is the focus. But probably going is best translated as a participle, as an imperative. Go and make disciples. So those are the I've tried to boil them down to 7 kinds of nuances that adverbial participles can have. And of course, an interlinear is going to go ahead and insert. I'm not 100% sure whether mounts and mounts do that, but this will move you to the next level. In most traditional approaches to Greek, you don't get to this sort of stuff until the 3rd and 4th semester, at least not much of it. But a lot of it can be understood even in the 1st semester. Arguably, most of it can. Adjectival participles. These are participles that tell you mostly about a noun. So adverbial participles are mostly verbal adjectives. Adjectival participles are mostly verbal adjectives. They tell you specifically about the man, the God who heals you. Who heals you could be a participle in Greek. Could also be a relative clause, as it is in English, but Greek prefers to put a construction like that into a participle construction. Again, if a participle has an article on it, then it is most certainly adjectival. If it doesn't, it's probably adverbial, although you have to use your common sense. It could be adjectival. In your translation, add the word who or which or that to your translation. So literally the coming one might be translated the one who is coming. Where did the word one come from? It came from this ending that tells you that this is referring to a masculine, which of course is generic in Greek, so we can translate it with one. And then the who came out of the fact that this is a participle with the article on it. It's an adverbial participle. So if a participle has the article, use who or that. If not, it's probably adverbial. This takes a lot of practice to do it cold turkey. The main purpose of this video is that you know what you're seeing in a commentary, or you know what you're seeing in a translation, because you can compare a translation with the original in an interlinear or in an analytical, and you can see, this particular translation has added some words to interpret this participle, but it is an interpretation. And if you understand this video lecture, this vidcast, then you can begin to decide whether or not you agree with the interpretation that the translation is done, and thus you become a better interpreter of the Bible. So this has been an overview of Greek participles, particularly as it comes to the New Testament.